One of the things we've been able to do for the past couple of years is to deal with the redevelopment agency, and where there were appropriate investments where land was held by the city and it made sense for that land to be held by the agency, is that we made transfers from the city to the agency. So the good news about that was we weren't selling in a down market to some third party. We were really benefiting the other half of ourselves. And so that made a certain amount of economic sense. I mean, the problem with one-time revenues is that they're not sustainable. They're only one time by definition, so the next year when you come back to balance your budget, when you used one-time revenues the year before, you got to start from scratch again the following year. But we have been able to use one-time revenues from redevelopment. The problem is the state just took $41 million of our redevelopment money because they needed it to balance their own budget. And we're in the situation where they're probably going to take more money next year. And so
That's no longer an option for us.
And so that option basically is closing down.
An important point to make there, Mayor, and you asked about this earlier, is the economic stimulus funding. Well, economic stimulus funding actually helped us this year. A major example is police officers that are funded by the economic stimulus funding. So, but that, in a sense, is also one time because it's going to expire 3 years from now. So we have utilized, as Cheryl mentioned, every one-time opportunity that we could think of. There are really no opportunities left for us to balance this budget on one-time sources. So we're down to layoffs first, and after we go through the layoffs, we would have to see if parcel tax or any other taxes pass, and if we could restore some of those jobs. Now, speaking about the parcel tax, we would be looking at a parcel tax of $1 a day to raise about $50 million a year. It's not a large amount of money. That's how much a lot of the newspapers cost these days. It's much less than a cup of coffee. And it would make a lot of our problems go away, and it would be a sustainable source of funding, $1 a day.
Whenever people start talking about going to the voters, we tend to talk about polls and try to figure out what's going to pass and what's not going to pass. You're saying that if you vote for something that is needed, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 a day.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That takes us out of this dilemma.
It would take us out of this dilemma for years.
That would be the ongoing funding versus sort of a one-time solution of
Yes.
a land sale or a transfer perhaps to other funds.
And then that allows you to think long-term, to plan long-term, to think 3, 4, 5 years out into the future, right?
It sure does. It
Okay.
sure does. And so we're sort of not in a mode of sort of having to continuously cut and balance the budget if we sort of kind of just cut sort of at the margins, if we cut sort of a little bit at a time.
You see, Mayor, we're just like the state of California, where they're dealing with the structural deficit, and we're dealing with the structural deficit. And that is why it's very important to look at ongoing revenues, which in the form of a parcel tax would help address the structural deficit.
Gotcha.
And if not, then you're back to cuts, because there are only two ways to balance the budget. It's either revenues or expenditures or a combination of the two. Let me address one other question, Mayor, that came up earlier. I know you asked it in different conversations, and that is the question of, well, why can't public employees, public sector employees contribute more? Well, as Dan mentioned, all of our unions, every single union, every single employee had no salary increases in the last 2 years and contributed 10% of their salary towards budget deficit. That has already happened. Even if they contributed 10% more, and 20% is a huge reduction to any individual to have, but even if they contributed 10% more, Cheryl, how much would that save us?
The savings would be for the total would be probably about $24 million, with police generating the largest savings. And it's interesting that you probably know.
That's if you went across the board.
For the three major sort of set union groups, police, fire, and civilians.
So 10% from the police department, police union would be about $7 million.
That's right. My point, it would actually be $13 million from police if it was based upon salary. But my point was that I was going to make earlier was that if police, like all the other unions, picked up a portion of their, of the city's retirement obligation to CalPERS, California Public Employees Retirement System, we would generate at least, I believe we said 7.9 million, just if they picked up 9% of their retirement payment. And I think the civilians are paying 8%, and fire is 13%. So the police, I believe, will pick up 2% in January 2013, which is nice, and we're looking forward to it, but there's an equity issue.
Okay. For the most part, on the public side of this ledger, people have put up a lot. The George Miller bill would, if it passed, give Oakland over a 2-year period about $133 million. Problem is, we have no knowledge of whether it's going to pass or not. Here's the problem. Conservative Democrats are saying, why should I contribute to the deficit to protect public jobs? It's not our responsibility to protect public jobs. And, you know, my point was, you guys need to confront this argument head on. Number one, a job is a job. And continuing to deal with this line of demarcation, which says, well, if you took that $100 million and created private sector jobs, we'd be willing to contribute to the deficit. But if you're just gonna save public sector jobs, we're not willing to do that. And I'm going, how insane? The number one, people live and die in the cities and the towns. And the last time I looked, members of Congress represent cities and towns. And if Oakland is typical of other cities around the country, their mayors are sitting with their staff exactly the same way we are, trying to figure out how to maintain basic services or make draconian cuts that compromise public safety, right? So that's the dilemma that we're in, which is people, this notion that public sector employees are nameless, faceless bureaucrats that are some way eating on the taxes of America. But people get up every day expecting those services. And the moment they don't see them.
And even if people believe that we all were nameless, faceless bureaucrats, the vast preponderance of public sector employees in the finance of the general fund are police and fire, and the people in the police and fire departments who support the sworn police and fire. So roughly 80% of the employees financed through the general fund are people who work in police and fire. It's the same way that the percentage of the money goes. Because in police and fire, they make the lion's share, much larger salaries than most other employees.
So let me ask this question. Given the fact that in our public safety strategy, our crime rate is down, we're 18%. I mean, this is major when you look across the country. So we're going in the right direction. So people are saying, now that we're gotten ourselves, you know, on the right flight path, don't blow this by cutting the police. We understand that. But here's the question. Pragmatically speaking, are there any other options other than the Miller bill magically passing quickly, the voters voting for $1 a day in November? Take those two off the table. There any magic?